Hello.
Welcome to Conversations with Life podcast. This is episode number 6, Trauma Awareness. I'm really excited and honored to be a part of this topic. Steve and I are both involved in different aspects of trauma work, and trauma awareness, being trauma informed, is a really powerful, helpful.
It's necessary to be. You want to be on a spiritual path now. You have to deal with trauma. I don't think that was the case when a lot of the old time religion was come up with, right? So the Eastern or Western, I don't think that trauma was as big a deal. But now there's like what I perceive, call me crazy, there's like a field of trauma that has to be dealt with.
Has to be met, yeah.
Has to be met. Personal and collective. There's a lot of trauma. And I think to be on a real path, a clear, honest, spiritual path, if you don't do trauma, if you aren't aware of trauma, it's very easy to get stuck, and it's very easy to get looped, and it's very easy to get used because of the big energies of the spiritual path. Especially if you're going to be on an ecstasis path, right? If you're going to be working with ecstasy, you damn well have to have your trauma worked with and understood. Locke Kelly talks about how there are 2 paths for every spiritual seeker now. He makes a really good case in this. I recommend his book, Shift into Freedom. He makes a really good case for the psychological path and the spiritual path. And that one complements the other in this age. That is a spiritual path. Like psychology, like that trauma path is no longer like an option. Hey, you should probably, work with your trauma or whatever.
Yeah, I feel like now that it's a thing that we need to meet. And I was thinking as we were sitting down, like, where did this first kind of come into my world? And I think at some level I was aware of it in parenting and that kind of thing. There were a few books starting to come out about being on the compassionate side of misbehavior, really, is kind of where that landed. And then as a midwife, huge. Lots of my trauma-informed care and education was in that space because I'm interacting with people's bodies. I'm interacting with their reproductive, health system where a lot of people are traumatized. And so recognizing, and understanding consent and touch, that's kind of where it all started for me.
Fascinating. And it's interesting because I think that kind of work gives you an automatic in to that, right? Like it's so immediate, it's so right there that how a midwife touches and works with somebody it's such a big energy container, right? That you just have to. You have to. And, education's somewhat that too, in my background in education, in that, you're working with students and you realize that they did not choose to have unattuned parents or ADHD or autism. They didn't choose any of this stuff, and you either have to kind of get into a hard line, like kids should be able to do this and meet the standards because that's the way that the thing is, or you get compassionate,
right?
And you see each person as a person, and you say, okay, what can you do? How are you encountering the world and the material in a way that is meaningful? And, education's moved more to that with multiple types of learning, understanding, but it's still not trauma-informed.
Truly.
Very well.
And the obstetrics system similarly, is
totally.
It's made leaps and bounds, but in general, and really that's kind of how I ended up in this whole sexual shamanism space, is that so many of my clients, I was the first person they ever talked about sex to. And here they are having a baby. I was the first person who had ever told them, you need to have permission before somebody, or other people need to have permission before they touch your body.
Right.
And they'd be like, oh, I'm fine.
You
don't need to ask. And I would say, here's the deal. I'm going to. Every time. Even if I did this yesterday, I'm going to ask again because this is something that like should be normalized.
Well, I'm thinking about that in education, right? Education without consent is probably the thing too, where you're touching somebody's brain and soul, and you're saying, "Here, kids," rather than, "Hey, let's do this." The buy-in from the student is the biggest thing. Their interest, their consent. When the student consents to their education, it happens, and if they don't, it's like walking through mud all day, and it's the ickiest feeling, So it's really interesting, and the word that comes up with compassion is, the first word that comes up of compassion is compassionate. I love Gabor Mates has this thing called compassionate inquiry, where he sits and they just ask questions and comes to the root of pain. So when you understand, like there's that old thing, the saying, if you really, really understand somebody, you cannot hate them. And that's very true. But what you find is a lot of people don't even understand themselves. They don't understand their traumas. They haven't been told to look at it. They've been told to do the thing because other people told them to do, or be the thing because other people told them to do it. And nobody has sat with a student, so many students, nobody has sat with them in any kind of compassion for their process, right? Too much challenge, too much put upon, too much misunderstanding of their patterns, and not enough compassion. And that, I think, probably is the way the world is. Who actually sits with somebody in their stuff?
Yeah, I had clients apologizing left and right for like making sound during birth. Right?
Sorry about the screaming.
They really wanted to be
good being torn
clients.
Out. Yeah.
Like their focus was more on I want to be a good client than it was on I want to have an experience that honors me.
Yeah.
And so, there's a little bit of like heartbreak looking back at the culture that we're kind of coming out of and how uncompassionate it was.
Unaware.
And how many things I tried to like willpower myself through and then just cycled back and cycled back and cycled back because it never was about the thing.
Yeah.
That I was trying to do. It was that there was some trauma there that was trying to figure itself out.
Yeah, and there's some pushback on this. There's some stuff out there that isn't compassionate. That's not wrong either. Like, we need to challenge people. We need to have high standards. We need to do all these things, right? And people say, "Oh, you're making people weak by recognizing that they have trauma." And it's so funny because that's exactly the opposite. Mm-hmm. If you don't want to control them.
Right.
And if you want them to be free and happy, then they show up in strength when that trauma is addressed, when compassion is expressed. Mm-hmm. When you want them to be them and not what you want them to be, then trauma is natural, right? And we're getting into this vibe, and trauma work and the work that I do with people, the work that you do with people, the work that we do with people becomes the big frickin' deal, right? I'm honored every day to work with people and hear their stories and sit with them and cry with them and understand them. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful process, and you realize how big this work is and how little it's being done, and I think done with compassion. It's done somewhat from ego. Follow me. Look what I'm saying. Do what I'm doing. I'm successful, and you need to attract them. Blah blah blah. Right. So there's that kind of like take it on thing, but like sitting in attunement compassion with people is not being done.
Yeah, and it's funny because personally, I can take stuff on with so much more ease and energy when I've had that attunement and that trauma addressed than when I'm just trying to resist it and push through it and willpower and grit it. And so it's funny because it's like the opposite of what we've really been programmed around is... it's really all the reward system of our culture is how controllable are you, and you're going to get a really good reward if you're controllable. Mm-hmm. And trauma gets in the way of that. Dang it!
It does get in the way of it. It really does. And this thing about willpower. Will is the most important. Is your most important power. Mm-hmm. Will is it, right? Will to what though, right?
Right.
Will to somebody else's ends. Will to the things that they tell you should want and do, and they control you with. Like, will to what? Mm-hmm. The will to express myself, the will to love. Those are the ones, the will to meaning. Those are the ones that are worthwhile. Mm-hmm. Power, as long as it serves, will to power, as long as it serves love, right? Mm-hmm. And But this culture of just do it, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can do it. You're just lazy.
Push
you know.
through.
People say that trauma, recognizing trauma, is blaming the victim, which is really a funny game, right? Gabriel addresses that a lot in his latest book, and it's so funny because that's exactly the opposite.
Right.
Telling somebody that they can do it no matter what is, when you haven't recognized their central patterns and central pains and do that.
You just have to
with compassion.
decide.
Yeah, you just have to decide today. And and the spiritual community is one of the worst.
The worst.
Right. Just make yourself good, and it'll be okay.
These really confident, kind of forceful memes out there that I just I catch them more and more, where it's that is not honoring of the trauma that people are dealing with. People are not on Netflix because they're lazy.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, they're
people
not.
People are not
they're
staying
looping.
in bed because they're lazy.
No, exactly.
Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah.
At least not, every day, right?
Or this bullshit that's built up on trauma, in church, where, some boy can't stop masturbating because he's addicted to porn because he has all this pain and not attunement, right?
Uh-huh.
And, I got nothing against porn. I don't love any kind of addiction. It's disempowering, right? And what happens is they're like, well, you just aren't righteous enough. You just don't love God enough. Oh my God,
Yeah, I
thought I was going to get AIDS and go to hell, and I still masturbated. Of course you're going, because there's pain there that's somehow not attuned and not understood, and if you don't understand it, you won't.
The energy's going to play you.
It's going to play you.
It's going to play you.
And those patterns we make people responsible for and say, you can do it. So there's this fun place where you can say you can do it. That's empowering. You're empowered, right? You control yourself. Also, you got to get clear, or you can't really say that.
Yeah, there are these energies that are compulsive, that are led by trauma, and you can only willpower and grit yourself against those for so long before something's gonna blow. And one of the things that was coming through was this whole kind of grit willpower thing, is that it feeds the parts of us that say we're not enough.
Which is the biggest wound.
Yeah.
It's the biggest thing.
So it's something's wrong with me, and if somebody can hook into that, then you're more controllable. And if they can tell you if you don't do this thing, or they can tell you if you do this thing, then you can escape that feeling of not being good enough. So if you could just go to the gym every day, and then it's not even about your health anymore. It's about not feeling like shit. Because somebody told me if I did this, then I wouldn't have to feel like something was wrong with me.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing, is to look at where things are coming from. So many people, and we talked about this in kind of the New Year's resolution thing, where the resolution is just trying to solve a loop.
Yeah.
And it's not trying to empower the person to their real soul self, right? It's I'm gonna work out because then I can bypass my other stuff into this activity, which is fine. I love a good bypass. but but at the same time, you want to get more and more real about your activity and really show up for yourself in that way. So it's really interesting to think about that way.
Yeah, and I think, and we're going to get into kind of renegotiation and versus reenactment a little bit later, but I think another trend is I'm on this spiritual path, I'm going into all these huge experiences, these containers where there's tons of energy, that ecstatic, energy, and what ends up happening is you kind of re-traumatize yourself. You leave the container, you have no idea what to do with what just happened. Because basically you just gave energy to all these wounded parts.
Yeah.
You come out of the container, you don't even know how to approach life anymore. And so you just have to keep going back for another hit of the plant medicine or the ecstatic dance or the sound bath or whatever it is, which all those things are awesome. If you're not trauma informed, you're just going to loop, your trauma is just going to loop right into those ecstatic events.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think that's true. Can I hit that?
Oh yeah, I had this really cool experience where I've been seeing a chiropractor for forever, 12 years or something. All these different chiropractors, all these different experiences, same issue, keeps coming back. I go into this chiropractor that happens to be a dear friend of ours. The first thing she says is, well, what has anybody done about your flat feet? And I was like, huh? That's bad? It's bad to have flat feet? I can make cool footprints. And all these years, nobody had ever addressed that, And I think years ago, had they addressed that, would I have been able to be with it? And I think the answer is no. That I would have taken that on as something wrong. Mm-hmm. Something broken. One more thing that I have to work on now in order to not feel like something's wrong with me. And so I would have, maybe they even said it and I didn't hear it, right? Maybe all those other chiropractors actually said it. And it was such a triumph for me on the way home from that appointment to be like so excited about working on my posture. Totally different experience than like this just devastation and stress and pressure that I would feel after appointments like that. Even if the chiropractor's like, hey, just take this vitamin. It was literally like a 2-month process for me to actually get myself to take the vitamin. And it's because of trauma. So, yay.
Yeah.
There's some energy there for actual improvement and growth.
And that's a big piece. And this gets us into our next thing, talking about parts. Because parts hold energy, right?
Yes,
parts are parts of you that are stuck in the past. And that's energy is stuck in your body somewhere, or it's stuck in this loop somewhere. And when you free up trauma, you free up energy, right?
Yes.
And to the point where I think a lot of people are just loops of energy going around, and none of it's going in any kind of direction. I mean, that's ADHD in a nutshell.
Yeah.
You're just like, all these things are going on, and you haven't really worked with it.
And you're exhausted.
Yes.
And you feel busy. But there's not any really like forward progression.
Yeah, because those are your parts trying to solve things in all these different ways. It's like a committee that nobody talks to each other, and everybody's doing their own thing to try to solve the problem and working against each other. I mean, that's how it works. So to give you the rundown on parts, and parts psychology is a big thing, and that's what I work with. I work with a modality called MAP. It's also called process method. There's IFS. There's others. We've probably mentioned it before, but if you haven't heard of part psychology, look it up. IFS, MAP method. It's a really useful way to think about trauma. And every time your system is overwhelmed, it doesn't know what to do. It forms a part, right? That's a trauma part. There's all sorts of parts. We drive a car; those are parts. We those are parts of us. We what's that called? When you dissociate, we dissociate them into the subconscious when we're not using them, and that happens to trauma parts too. So say that you were a little kid, your mom said no cookie, right? And your system did not know what to do with mom saying no cookie because you feel like you should have a cookie, right? There's nothing in you that knows why you shouldn't have that. So when mom says no, and mom loves you, and so you're like, wait a minute, mom loves me, and I love cookies, and so what is going on? And the system goes, brah, right? You got a trauma part, right? They showed up too, and it's just an innocent thing, but that's enough to make a part.
I've heard it described a couple different ways, and I think both are effective. One is your main personality kind of gets pushed out, and a clone is put there in its place. And then when the traumatic event is over, the main personality comes back, and the clone either goes to like outer darkness where the event is never remembered again, or somewhere in your subconscious. And I've also heard it as like a freeze frame that gets like stuck on your TV. I think this might be the Michael Singer version. And so like you have all these images that are frozen, and like that's what you're looking through when you're going out in the world.
Yeah, well, that energy of that frozen image is stuck, whatever motion, and all parts have a body, so whatever body sensations you had at the time are in that part, and then when something like that happens, so you're 8, and your mom says no, you can't have that bike. all of a sudden this 2-year-old part comes in.
Yeah.
And
you start acting like a 2-year-old.
The 8-year-old acts like the 2-year-old, and the parents are bewildered. Why in the what? I've taught you better than this. And then they put shame on top of that, which doesn't make the part any better, by the way.
Right.
So, and no parent but gets this right because it's super frustrating, and no person gets this right because when people start acting like a 2-year-old when they're 40, here's a part that's activated that they've never had worked with. What does the 2-year-old need?
Just needs
compassion.
Love.
Needs love. He needs to know that they're loved, because in that moment where they were told they couldn't have a cookie,
it felt like not love.
And that couldn't, and the 2-year-old can't handle that, right?
Right.
And then, so the 8-year-old couldn't handle not getting a bike, and so he screamed and yelled, and the parents punished them and put them in the room instead of trying to understand what's going on there.
Yeah.
And now we have a compounded part. And now when the person is told no from the person that they're trying to hit on,
right,
they all of a sudden feel like, oh, mom doesn't love me, let's get him a bike. And all that shit is coming into that, right?
Yeah.
So they're crushed. Instead of being like, okay, not for me, cool, I can handle. It's like, oh, mother's love and the universe does not love me. It's like way out of control.
Disconnect.
And how many other pieces of no got in there in that that are kind of all joined in this committee of no that are now all parts working together in some kind of structure.
And then if your parents when you were 8 were like, what's wrong with you, why are you acting like this, you have another part on top of that that's like, okay, you're gonna feel like a 2-year-old, but you better not show anyone.
Because that's bad, right?
Because then you're going to feel even more disconnected.
Yeah, and the typical triangles, you have the victim, who feels like a victim because they have no power. And then you have the pain part, who's like, oh, mom doesn't love nothing loves me. And then you have the judgment parts, who are up there going, you shouldn't feel like that, don't show it, don't hide it. Or that take on the parent's voice and say, when you feel like this, you're bad because this is not how a good boy acts. Right? Okay. It's a lot.
Pause for some
tears. Oh God! Right? So if you're listening to this and you haven't heard of this kind of stuff before, you understand how people get bound up, and how if you want to be on a meaning path, how this fucks up all the meaning paths, soul or spirit or any other path. Certainly the ecstatic path. Right? Because when you want these big energies moving through, and this is why, by the way, psychedelic. You build this unhealthy ego on top of all these parts, put together in some habitual reactions, and you create monsters. Right. And so trying to unwind all this, you go into an experience, and all of a sudden you feel your divinity coming through in an ecstatic experience. And those parts are going, what? That's not us.
Yeah.
But we'll get to a lot of this in our narcissist class that we're teaching later this month. You should join.
Yeah.
And no, we're teaching next Sunday actually. Yeah. If you're seeing this week. But this is an interesting thing. Okay, so it's really interesting to understand that the Gabor Mate question, why the pain? Don't ask why the behavior. Ask why the pain. Is such a beautiful question. Like in a construction, it's just beautiful. Like if we could just tell every teacher and every doctor and every parent that phrase, just like okay, here's the first thing you gotta know. Don't ask why the behavior. Ask why the pain. And if you could get to the bottom of that pain, it's a different world.
Yeah,
it's a different world.
Well, and I think about in relationship. That's a really hard place to ask that question, because a lot of times somebody else's poor behavior wakes up our trauma parts, and so our pain needs a place to go, and it's way easier to be mad at their behavior than to ask about their pain and potentially have our parts actually meet each other and see each other at that level of vulnerability.
Totally.
But it's possible.
It's possible, and it's how you have real relationship, rather than having a relationship with somebody's trauma, which is what we mostly do.
Yeah.
And it's fun. We should do that, and then break apart, and then figure this shit out. It's what we do. So going along with part psychology, in the book Why Buddhism is True, talks about how this new idea of how the brain works, and what's this guy's name? How Buddhism is True. told you today. But anyway, good book. Look it up. Fascinating neuroscience on spiritual process, and really an amazing thing. And so he's talking about how the old idea of the brain was you have an executive function, and the materials view of the brain, was like this corporate guy, this guy in a suit sitting in the middle of your brain. I pictured, kind of like in the war room, and then he's looking around at all the parts of the brain. He's like, which one should I activate next? And you just want to get a well-trained executive that gets in there and does all the things right, and picks exactly what to do, and just willpower, you do it. Mm-hmm. That's not how it works at all. Turns out, for most people, that executive function is a stoned teenager. And he's in there going, dude, this is cool. Look at all this stuff. And then, whatever shiny thing happens in the brain happens to have the most energy. They're like, oh, look at that, Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that gets the attention of the executive, so-called executive. Mm-hmm. Now I just changed it to the stoned teenager part of their brain.
So whatever is having an energy experience of some kind is going to get attention.
And of any kind. Right? So what's the default human experience? Pain. Right? So often parts use pain and hold on to pain, and they store it in the body. Mm-hmm. Right? We say that the body holds trauma, and the mind is the keeper. Uh-huh. It's the prison guard, right? that keeps it, or the prison system that keeps the pain in the right place so it doesn't come up again or whatever. But all that energy is stored in the body. And, again, those parts, bodies have signatures, etc. Anyway, so you have the, stick with the cookie theme. You have the I want a cookie part, meme, as he calls it in the book. And then I want to lose weight part. And then
you have the part that said, if you eat cookies, you're going to get fat.
yeah, right?
Because that's a whole other story,
that's a whole other story. Yeah, right, which is so funny. And we live on this programming, right? And it's so fun when the I want a cookie part has energy. Now, what is a cookie trying to do? Maybe alleviate pain. Maybe now that I'm adult, I can have a goddamn motherfucking cookie.
Right, so if something else is feeling out of control in your life, having a cookie is like, I can have a cookie.
And you're like, I'm going to love myself. Right? I don't need you, Mom.
And then the other part comes in is like, now you're going to get fat. I can't believe you did that.
Yeah. So who gets the most pain? Who gets the most energy? Well, this part over there that's like, let's keep care of ourselves. Let's make sure we don't eat too many cookies, It has to have power to get noticed. And so, things like having accountability. Someone else is going to ask me about this cookie, and I don't want to do it. The embarrassment is a good motivator. There's a lot of things that we can do, but really what we need to do is turn the level down of pain available to all the parts. And that's what trauma does. And so the parts that then are available for self-care are much more there, because self-care feels beautiful. It feels beautiful to eat healthy and balanced. Right? It feels good. So that feeling good, and let's say, should we say ecstatic, feeling good, having all the energy that you can have as a human being feels great. That should be a lot of energy, but the pain is louder. So it's like turning down the pain to the level where that life thing, that tension of life can be felt. Otherwise, the tension of pain overwhelms it, and you never can really focus on that really juicy place of
right, because when you're eating the cookie, the experience you're having is the pain of the resistance because there are parts telling you it's wrong. So you don't ever actually get to eat the cookie. So you never experience the satisfaction of a cookie. And I feel like this is kind of where addiction starts to loop. Is that you go towards something with your pain to alleviate the pain, but you miss out on the satisfaction of having the pain alleviated because there's already another part putting pressure on you for doing the thing.
Totally.
So you just get in this loop of pain and like, oh, this thing's gonna relieve my pain, but the second you do it, you have another part there that's putting pressure on you again.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. And that, so it's really interesting to think about that executive idea is so out of date, the way that we adapt. Now the cool thing about the brain though is that it adapts and it's agile, and that creates this thing where it's more like an organism, the brain, than a machine. and it's its own organism, and it has its own flow, and so this is the energy revolution idea, where the flow of energy, the flow of ideas, the flow of thoughts, the amount of energy we're accessing through what channels is the thing that really creates wholeness, and not we're just going to construct the brain just right and have the right sequence of things happen at the right time like a machine. It's very different. And so I'm going to check the camera.
Okay.
You say something interesting.
Well, I'm going to wait until you come back.
Okay. All right, we're still cooking.
We're good? Okay.
We're at 30 minutes.
So I have a question, Steve.
Yes. Please ask me.
I hear all the time these beautiful memes that say, follow your heart. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, follow your heart, follow your intuition, trust yourself. No, it's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea, and it's the best idea ever. Right? Both things are absolutely true. You should follow your heart. You should find that interconnection, that soul self that's trying to speak to you that none of us have whole access to. And you should find a way to listen. And you have layers of trauma over that thing. And when you're following your heart, and you think you're following your heart, you think you're following your intuition, and it's really a trauma reaction. You get into a relationship. I just love him. I just love her. You're not doing something that's really smart. So I say get clear, get conscious, and go deep into there and follow and listen to your heart. Don't necessarily follow your heart, but practice listening to your heart.
That.
Listen to your intuition. Stay attuned with it, and then ask, truth or trauma?
Truth or trauma?
That's always the question, truth or trauma. If you're just following your heart, if you're one of those romantic people who sees that meme and you just, something strikes you or whatever, it's probably a trauma thing. High school relationships. Perfect example. Nobody would look at a high school relationship and watch these kids fall in love and say, that's not love.
Right.
Because it's beautiful. These people meet each other, they see each other, something happens or whatever. But nobody would say, you should get married right now, kids, because this is the real thing.
Yeah.
Right? That's a real relationship. That's as mature. I mean...
And most people aren't looking back on their teenage relationships and being like, wow, that was so healthy.
Yeah, most people are not. I mean, they might be wistful about it. They might be some memories or whatever. I wish I was that stupid again, that kind of thing. But they're not looking back and saying, that's the relationship I want in my life, most people. And the reason why is that neither of those young people knows themselves. They haven't had enough experience. They haven't had enough learning. They've been miseducated for the most part about everything.
Yeah.
And
and they have trauma.
And so they don't know themselves. Somebody a little bit more mature who's had some experiences, who has a better sense of self, even they should get clear before, committing themselves to those lifelong relationships, because, I got married when I was 21, coming off a mission saying, yep, this is what I'm supposed to do, build Zion, whatever. I didn't look at the trauma patterns in the relationship. I didn't know myself. She didn't know herself really well. And, I don't regret any relationships, and I really don't regret that one. It's the most beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, know yourself, says Socrates. Know thyself. The unexamined life is not worth living. There's a reason for that. And it's not just because it's a mental exercise. We want to analyze things to death and be all Socratic. It's because there's shit running around there. There's beasties running around in there, and there's an overlay of muck over your heart that you do not understand. I guarantee you. And it's the work of a lifetime to get clear enough, to have enough self, to have enough soul, so that when you follow your heart, you're really doing it. You're really following the heart. You're really following the intuition.
And it's really getting you to connection and intimacy. I feel like the whole thing with compulsion is you have this uprising of energy. Trauma parts get a hold of it, and it's like this feeling of being driven towards something that sometimes feels totally out of control. So you're driven towards a behavior with so much energy.
And you're dissociating everything else.
And nothing else matters. And this is what all the movies are about, and it's so sad because
so
they
sick.
tell us if
wrong and the
if you're not dissociated, it's not love. But anyway, you're driven to this thing.
I'm gonna make a meme. If you're not dissociated, it's not love. Post that to everybody that posts the follow your heart thing.
And so yeah, you get the compulsion, you're driven towards it, and there's so much energy, and you're like, yes, this is it. And the level of disappointment that you feel when you've been taken like that, and you do the thing, and it's not it.
It's not it.
And I think that is the why.
Mm-hmm.
Get enough of your personal energy back from your trauma so that you can be in a place of choice. You can be in a place of responsiveness so that you can actually say, okay, I have all these energies and I have all these options.
Mm-hmm.
And what really honors me and what really honors the people around me, that's going to create the actual intimacy and connection and experience with life that I want.
Yeah. And just sitting with your heart and listening, and it will blah, 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 right?
Mm-hmm.
In motions. And sitting with your mind, too, in blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
And it will say a bunch of stuff. And then most of it's nonsense. Most of it's programming. Most of it's patterns. Most of it's trauma. And then there's true stuff in there. I love Pendergast in the book, The Deep Heart, asked this question. It's so beautiful. What is my deepest knowing about this? And then you listen. And you ignore that answer. Or you dig deeper. Yeah. What is my deepest knowing until you feel it click? Mm-hmm. And even then you don't know, right? Mm-hmm. This is a lifelong practice to get to the center of oneself, right? How many looks to the center of a human heart? Crunch. You fall in love. Crunch. Twin flame experience.
An experience that we had where we're in a beautiful sharing energy experience together, and you have this like, what do you want question come through.
Yeah, what do you want?
And that question comes into the field, and I'm in this thing where like, well, I just want my beloved to feel good. And it's like, I want to secure this person's love.
Yeah.
Right? And like, that was a painful seeing and also so empowering. It was like, oh, there's a place where that compulsion is happening, and I actually want to show up in service, not in this space of like, I'm trying to secure your love because that makes me feel safe.
Right.
And so it was this beautiful question. And so it's like, look and listen and watch your process. And one of my favorite things that you say with the truth or trauma is, if you don't know, lean in, is truth or trauma. If you don't know the answer, lean in, and your trauma will lead you to your truth.
Yeah.
And I love that. And I think about these little sort of mile markers on the spiritual or the consciousness path that seem to happen to a lot of people. There's some kind of like big twin flame, or there's some kind of false guru disillusionment thing where we put all our energy into some practice or person or religion or whatever, and then there's the spiritual ego where we start to feel really good at spirituality, and there are these things, and we can try to avoid them, and that in and of itself becomes a trauma path to truth.
It does. Watch a lot of people break from religion right now because religion isn't holding the energy. They're not honoring the amount of energy that wants to come through people. And so, a lot of people breaking out of religion, and it's a heartbreak because, you followed the prophet, or you admired the Pope, or you whatever. You did the practice.
Yeah.
You really bought into this as a system and as a thing. And most religion doesn't have the capacity to really honor the amount of energy coming through people. Most religion is certainly not trauma informed, right?
Right.
It has this idea that there's this moral good that's going to be good, and I can't remember if we talked about this before the break, but there's two different ways that people are off this path, and where they're ignorant, where they're going to get their heart broken, and that's they get so moral, so right on this side, and they get so hedonistic on this side, and they're going to follow the body on this side. I guess that takes us to our body and mind thing. What we're doing. But like on this side, you're so much this way, and you're gonna break. The world will not follow your moral absolutes. It's too energetic. It's the living thing. It's going to create itself, and you're creating yourself in a way that just can't hold rigid rules. And on this side, you're going to be unattuned. You're going to get into the body so deeply that you can't hold. You're going to get into that side of things, and you're going to break or die. Soul people are known for dying. Soul and spirit, and so this works. And so that gets into this idea that we've mentioned already, and that is the body, it holds the trauma, and the mind is the prison guard and the prison, right? And so that's an interesting game. So the question is, what do you start with? Well, the mind follows the body, and the body follows the mind, right? So if you start with the body, the mind will be like, okay, what's going on down there, right? I hear so much of pain being released. What's going on? I'm going to have to reorganize around that. Okay, sure. And when I work with people in trauma and doing parts work, they'll often feel energy or pain or, have a dramatic energy experience. A woman I was working with yesterday, day before, I think, was feeling the parts of her that had been beat up as we're working with getting physically hit, parts of her that were beat, kicked.
So you're doing a largely psychological process.
She's
having a body.
I'm not hitting her, right? Right. She's having this body experience. So the body follows the mind, and the mind follows the body, which is a really important thing to know. But what happens if you do both?
It's awesome.
It's awesome.
So awesome.
The clients that we are privileged to work with together go so fast. It is amazing. It's been
so beautiful,
stunning to see what happens when you work both sides of that.
It's almost like a bit of a check and balance, because I do think that if you lean heavily on one or the other of those, the trauma parts will kind of get wise.
They do,
and they'll loop into it, right?
Yeah.
And so the having the psychological and the somatic work together is kind of a check and balance. It's also really helpful in the sense that when you do one or the other, you're going to get active parts that are going to want to flood the system. And if you have a way to move the energy physically that pops up during the psychological process, you're going to move through that and you're less likely to get stuck. And vice versa, when, for instance, this happened to me, I tried CrossFit for a while. And there was a lot of things I really loved about the intensity of it, because I'm a hella intense person. But what would happen is I would start somatically processing, because I was pushing myself to such physical limits. I would have parts wake up, and I would either have to run in the bathroom and puke, because I'm such a body processor, right? Like my system's so used to that. Or I would be like leaning over the medicine ball just weeping. And it wasn't really, like, nobody in that container knew how to be with that. So it was just like, get up, Soch! Keep going! And I'm like, I'm not crying because this is hard. I'm crying because, like, there's something happening. So anyway, it's a way to kind of work with both because they are in conjunction with each other.
Well, and it's beautiful, and I feel like kind of almost like when we do that, we kind of tee it up for each other, right? So you'll have the session, and somebody, something will come out, and then that will get worked through the parts, and we'll start talking to parts and start working with that. And you can even do that in session, but there's something about specifically working with one side of that, right? That kind of like creates that that really I don't know, something about that, and so there's modalities that do both too. There's a lot of stuff out there that's really interesting. Go seek it out. I just, so just a little bit more attuned to the body. I'm a little bit more attuned to the mind when it comes to trauma and it's really beautiful to work it out both ways. You know, if you only do somatic, I think you're missing something.
I do, and I think that you're gonna get either that trauma loopy thing where it's like, oh, I have to go work. You start to become dependent on, I have to go work out, or I have to do this emotional release thing, because the trauma is just gonna keep looping into that process, into that practice. But if you can go into that psychological space and be like, hey, like, let's actually release the trauma here.
Yeah.
Then you can kind of move into more of a healed space than that loopy trauma cycle.
And on the other side, we misunderstood the mind for so long that we were trying to put people on the couch and talk them better, you know, which works to a point. But, you know, at some point, stuff's got to happen in the body. That energy is held there. And some assistants figuring that out, a lot of assistants figuring that out in the body is also really, really helpful. And I think we did the mind thing and pretended people were minds, you know.
Right.
And the body was just kind of this afterthought about how we work with people, right?
Or the body's just a thing to manage in this really weird world.
Yes. Yeah. If you get the mind right, then the body will be okay. And, you know, that doesn't work either.
Yeah.
It's an energy game, right? And it's a whole energy system. And mind and body and mind, there's no real difference. It's you manifesting around energy. And that energy is expressed all those different ways. And, and, you know, because we can be conscious, we get looped, you know, physically, mentally, energetically, spiritually, emotionally. All those things happen. And so it's fun to dig those out and really work those together.
Another thing about the embodiment process that I love is giving people / their trauma parts kind of new ways to be, so that healed part, it has a role, it has education. So part of my work is educating people about, like, hey, here's a way that you can be more trauma informed about yourself and about others as you move into everyday life. This is a way to bring like everyday life.
The body it's a lived experience.
Yeah.
And that brings it home. So I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
What can somebody do to really work with body trauma? And I mentioned earlier that, you know, you can do parts psychology for the mind. You can do therapy, great. You can do also different kinds of therapy, great. There's some somatic therapy that's out there that does both. You can do IFS work, no bad parts, self-therapy. But from your perspective, working with clients, working with people, what would you say, like, is the thing that people can do
to starting
somatically, starting today, work with their trauma as they've been aware about it?
A couple things pop into my head. One is noticing. It's my favorite new game. No matter what's going on, take a minute to notice what your body is feeling. What is the sensation? So you get triggered. Your mind's immediately going to take hold of that and try to create a story / solution based on past events. Most of the time, that's not very helpful.
Totally.
Because you're going to start acting like a 2-year-old in a second, right? So when you feel the activation, drop into your body with your consciousness. What is happening? What's alive? What's the sensation? Where is that sensation living? Is it over here in my neck? Is it down here in my solar plexus? Is my foot hurting? And then get as specific as you can with the sensation. Is it squeezing, pinching, hot, cold? What's happening? And as you drop into your body and begin to explore that, first of all, you're integrating better with your whole system. You're also, by questioning and noticing, you're engaging more into the front part of your brain. So you're less likely to be in that fight-flight space where you're going to be in reactivity. But also, you're starting to notice your body. And hi, we have bodies. It's a fun part of life.
Right.
And it gets to be a game where even those challenging moments, when you start to notice what your body's experiencing, then you get to start feeling more. When you feel more, you get to feel more of the good stuff too. Also, you're in a a heightened situation with a loved one, right? Somebody gets triggered. Somebody's mad. Well, I had this experience with my husband. We're on a drive. I make a suggestion like, hey, do you want to listen to this book together? And it triggers him hard. And so I just was like, okay. Take your medicine, Soch. And I just said, hey, I'm noticing that my heart's beating really fast and my solar plexus just got really tight. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, the energy just went. Because instead of my defense rising up to his trigger, I just spoke the truth. Mm-hmm. So just saying what your body's feeling, nobody can argue with that. Mm-hmm. You do not.
Yeah.
I'm cold right now. No, you're not. Yeah. Right? Yeah. It's that space of inarguable truth that can really bring everybody's nervous systems down to a more reasonable level.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. Noticing what's the sensation. What's the sensation? I say it all the time. When somebody's triggered, what's the sensation? Mm-hmm. And then the other one is emotional release tools, which I teach. You can probably even look them up. My favorite one is just the silent hand scream, where you take a deep breath and you silently scream into your hand and you move as much of your body as you can. And it's amazing how much energy is released and how much more clear you feel after you come from that charged space, discharge the energy, and then you have the capacity to move forward. Again, you can loop into emotional release tools and become dependent on them and never really actually heal the trauma. So that's another place where also doing the psychological subconscious work is really powerful.
Yeah, really good stuff. All of that is good. I mean, you can work consciously, you can work subconsciously, you can work with the body. And, there's a myriad ways to look at trauma. A lot of people are figuring this out now. There's a kind of renaissance of trauma awareness and understanding. But honestly, it just comes down to that. Give it some attention. Give it some work. So a couple
love and compassion.
Love and compassion.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. A couple things you want to, when we're talking about trauma awareness. A couple things you want to know about trauma. And I get this from Peter Levine, and I think it's a well-known trauma response, right? So we've talked about loops, and what a loop is that your system came up with a problem that it couldn't solve. It got overwhelmed, and that's when the trauma part was made. But the system wants to understand that thing, and it wants to close the loop and get resolution and get into an easement of the tension. So we'll keep trying to find ways in which that will work. So you get in a bad relationship. The relationship ends badly because it's a bad relationship. And you're like, oh shit, that's terrible, I'll never do that again. So you meet somebody who's a lot like that person, but just a little bit better. And you're like, oh, this is better. And everybody around you going, what the hell are you doing, right? Why would you get into a relationship with that person who's a lot like the person that you were just in a relationship, but you can't see it because they're just a little bit better. And your whole system is just dying to replay this whole thing again. So that at the other side of that, you can get resolution, right? And so we loop into these patterns. And so it's really, really beautiful. And I think talk therapy, one of the things it does is this. Is to recognize that you are in a pattern, or a wise friend, or somebody that's doing therapy for you in whatever sense, and they're observing to you your patterns. You can start to see those loops. At some point, you're not going to renegotiate that by yourself, or you're not going to renegotiate that before you do some work on that pain. And so you just, when you see yourself getting in repeating patterns, there's trauma. And a lot of people are like, why do I keep doing this? Why is everybody always picking on me? Why do I attract bullies? Why do I keep losing my job? Why do I keep getting these relationships? Why do I keep over and over again? Why do I always get sick? There's so many things that we do.
Why do I keep trying diets that
why do
I can't do it?
Why does Charlie Brown always try to kick that goddamn football.
Right?
Because he's so in his system. It's just like, I've got to solve this loop.
Yeah.
Right? And the answer is renegotiation. Renegotiation is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing. You can do it imaginatively. Peter Levine, Healing Trauma, highly recommend his active imagination exercises that he guides on there, where you go back in your mind and you actually do the thing that you want to finish in your imagination. So it kind of helps the energy find a place to go, so that it's not looking to loop into these reenactments.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people get into practice. Spiritual practice is often a reenactment, right, of the trauma. Because this will be different.
Yeah.
You know, this path wasn't right. This person was bad, but I'm going to go for this teacher over here and do the same thing. They're a little bit better than the old teacher. Or, you know, we just reenact all sorts of things.
I did that as a homeschooler.
Oh, interesting.
Like, I would buy the next cool curriculums.
Because this will be our time.
This is going to be it.
This is going to be it. This is going to make this change my life. When, you know, there really are no answers, but your answers. And to, you know, that's another, a whole other podcast. Renegotiation is really, really valuable. You can do it in your life. You know, if you're conscious of this, you can start to think, okay, I see the pattern. How do I renegotiate the pattern? It's a really beautiful question. What do I know about this? What's my deepest knowing about this? How do then I renegotiate this in an honoring way rather than in a way that is coming from pain?
And I think that's a lot of what we do in Conscious Connections, honestly, is we give people tools for renegotiation. Here's how you can make an honoring request. Here's how you can receive a no answer. You know, in an...
All right. Well, as you can see, we cobbled this together and we get it done. And I hope the information is really valuable. I feel this discussion is good. I do want to just say we're not professionals. You can see the little power director thing on the thing. I ain't about the software. We just feel like we have some things to share, and it's really fun to have these conversations. We were talking about reenactment versus renegotiation. And we were talking about how, you know, even in spiritual community you can reenact, and you talked about how you did this in homeschool. Where were we from there?
I think we got through that pretty good. And we were going to kind of move into this one other aspect that seems to be a pattern, and that is identifying with your trauma and how it can be really hard to move through that once you've formed an identity around it.
Yeah, Eckhart Tolle has a great quote on this where he's like, you know, the first thing you got to do is stop identifying with the pain. And that's a hard thing to say to a person in trauma. Like, most things are hard to say to a person in trauma because you don't see it, you know? You don't see the way that you've built your identity around the pain that you're feeling, and the pain almost becomes your meaning.
Yeah.
So when you say stop hurting, some of you is hearing stop meaning what I mean, you know? And that's not an easy game, right? This is the ego game, and it's the bad ego game, and it's really hard to do.
Yeah, and part of the thing is that the trauma parts, because they didn't get something that they needed, or they were overwhelmed or under-resourced, they're still trying to find that thing. And one of the ways they can sort of move towards getting that thing, which is usually some kind of attention, right, is pain. It's a way you can get people's attention. And it's just shitty to be in that place where you're like, I'm feeling pain and I feel like I need attention for it, and also I don't want that to be the thing.
Yeah.
And so what do we do with that seeming like dichotomy of like either or, both things suck. Like not telling someone about our pain because we don't want to like be manipulating them for their attention. But then also that the pain then never really gets an outlet or a way to heal or move.
And, you know, the answer is love expressed from the people we're with, and love for ourselves, right? So that's the answer, is that someone's got to hold that pain just absolute understanding, right? And we can do that for ourselves. Others can do that for us, and hopefully we do that together, right?
Do a little bit
and
of
we're
both,
like, yeah, we know that there's pain, and we know that it's there, and it's not fun to see some of the patterns that we have, and the pain that we built around pain that we thought were like essential parts of ourselves, and when you do trauma work, it's amazing what becomes more important and less important, and you're like, oh, that was just a whole trauma game.
Yeah.
And it's not bad trying to release pain through some activity, becoming an artist because of pain. It's a classic thing, right? Or a musician because of pain. Like the blues, like the meeting pain that way is beautiful. Turning pain into art, is great. But if you have to hurt and keep hurting to art, you'll self-destruct, as some artists do.
I love that.
But if you can work through that pain without bypassing it, then you still have the wisdom. You don't need to lose your artistic drive,
right?
Unless you bypass, right? If you're bypassing into like, I'm now a happy, good person, and I'm gonna, then you're gonna lose yourself because you've left those parts behind. And I say no parts left behind, right? Like
you get to keep the skills.
You get to keep the
even
skills,
if they were built on a trauma
and the understanding and the wisdom. We want all of those parts to stay, but a lot of the ways that we work with pain are medication or whatever, which does kill some drive. It does kill some of the better, more creative parts of ourselves, or it quiets them along with the pain, right? That's why medication is not a good permanent solution to most mental health issues, in my opinion. Dr. Martha's opinion. It's good for the meantime to stabilize somebody, to help somebody. There's a lot of ways that we can do that are wise. But putting somebody on pain meds and say that's the answer is not helping. In my opinion, and others telling somebody this is wrong with you, it'll always be wrong with you is not helping in most cases. It's an identity, a diagnosis to some degree is an identity built on pain, right? And so, recognizing those patterns and seeing those patterns and understanding, I'll always have an ADHD pattern, but I don't want to identify as that and be like, well, and defend that as my, my mode of being because, because of what I suffered around it. Anyway,
we're always so much more than our identity.
We can honor the suffering and move into the past the story,
the bigger
past the identity, past the bigger experience. So anyway, it's just really fascinating. Trauma awareness, I think, is a big, big issue, and I think it's under talked about in the spiritual community, right? I think trauma understanding. I think a lot of people are out there saying we're working with trauma because of our breath work, or we're working with trauma because of our medicine work, but then there's not the integration. Right? And all those things are good for trauma, and they will move energy and they will get places, but to really understand how this is constructed, to get into a little bit deeper work with parts or whatever method that you can psychologically, really, really important. Integration should do that.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't do that, you're not getting integrated. And so, become trauma informed. Read some books on trauma.
Yeah. Personally become informed. Find some support people that are trauma informed.
Totally.
So helpful, especially because whatever method you use to release pain from these trauma parts, if there are things that you've been doing in your life, and I guarantee there are, were motivated by trauma, and that pain is no longer there as a driving or motivating force, you're going to have these periods where you're like, ugh.
Yeah.
Now, what do I do?
Yeah, death lodge.
Having people in your world that can support you in that. And I think also having a few things that you're like, all right, there are a few, 1 to 3 things a day that I'm committed to doing that are healthy. No matter what. So so that you don't just totally fall off the earth.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways.
I've been in that place where it's like I have zero motivation for any of this because it all feels like it was trauma.
Yeah, and you have to reset whatever, and finding efficient ways to heal that, and that's why I do what I do. Mm-hmm. I'm all about the spiritual path, right? But I end up being a trauma healer because that's what it needs. It needs the most efficient, effective work that I can find and that I can do myself. And others might have really amazing stuff that they're doing that's great and awesome. But we all are on our journey to do this. But just know that you're gonna have to do trauma. You're gonna have to. You can't not face that stuff. Okay, so I think that's good. This is a good conversation. I think it's really important. And in the modern world, this is the way life is speaking to us through those trauma patterns, and it's bringing awareness of this really up to there. So, like, as far as having a conversation with life, you can't do that with not talking about trauma and not being aware of trauma.
Yeah, and I think we'll do a podcast on like the various healing paths, right? Different ways, different things you can play around with and see what really works. And I want to just plug the part psychology thing, particularly the process treatment, because I've tried so many. And I feel like what that method does that I haven't seen as much with others is it's almost like the training that I got as a midwife on consent is like brought deep into that part's work, where every part is being honored, you're getting consent, and so you're way less likely to re-traumatize yourself when that structure is there. So I just wanted to plug that because it's been really powerful for me.
And it's just so freaking efficient. You know? It really does some good work. I'm just stunned by it, all the time. I'm just like, whoa. Wow. Same. I had this reaction. I mean, we'll talk about this in that next one, where I had certain reactions, self-consciousness that was absolutely insane. And it just went away. And here I am, I have no nervousness doing this kind of thing, and teaching and being in front of groups and being in vulnerable situations. I just don't have any of that. That is remarkable. That's the work of a couple of years.
That just happened.
Just happened. And this would be 10, 20 years of therapy, I think. It would be a lot to work with that. I don't know,
So I want to use that example for just one last little hit on this identity thing, because I think that might be helpful for people. If you had built a strong identity structure around your self-consciousness, that would have been more challenging for you to integrate into your everyday life, because you would have found yourself in a situation where you're normally self-conscious, and maybe you would have been like, oh, I'm so self-conscious, and you would have had this whole identity thing around it, and to find yourself in that situation without the self-consciousness, it would have actually been like disturbing.
It is disturbing, and like, who wants to hang out with that guy who's like, oh, whatever, right? And there's a certain amount of attention you get from that. The way I phrase it is like, nobody likes me. Everybody hates me. Nobody likes me. And I do get some funny. That's shifted into I get funny reactions, but it isn't that nobody likes me. It's that I have whatever particular kind of energy or whatever going on in my personality, and perhaps things still defined. And okay.
Yeah.
But now I no longer identify with any of that. It's all like watching this play that happens in my head. A great thing about part psychology is that it takes you away from it being personal.
Yes.
Now you're working with parts, and see that it's like mindfulness, where it immediately creates this separation. Like, here's this host of interesting characters in me, and I'm over here going, oh wow, look at that.
How interesting.
How interesting that they do this, right? And instantly that relieves some of the energy from that they pull, because they're not so blended in the IFS terms. They're not so blended,
Yeah.
And IFS, I think we'll hit a whole thing on that and talk about that. And anyway, this has been a pleasure. Thank you if you got this far. Again, thank you for listening to this podcast. and to this YouTube channel, whatever we're doing. And we're going to do more. Look for the launch in the next coming weeks, years, months of the Conversation with Life Network. We're sure it's going to happen. Just living into life, following the energy, following the flow, and it will happen. It will be really cool. Thank you for listening again. Conversation with Life, episode 6.
Yay!
Over.